Hi, thanks you all for coming to Boulder City's Historic Preservation Day. You know, the magic number in historic preservation is 50 years. And 50 years is you know, this milestone where something becomes historic, like myself. And there might be a couple other you out there that may have hit 50. And really the question is, you know, we are historic and now it's up to the rest of us to decide, are we worth preserving or not? So anyway, thank you. That's kind of the question we're going to be asking today. But you know, the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to recognize the Boulder City Historical Committee. And you guys can stand up. My committee over here. I'm Alan, we're in the Sheriff Committee, but you know, this wouldn't happen without these volunteers. So we have Claire Davenport, Linda Graham, Rudy Kraft. Where's Rudy? Rudy's around here someplace. Okay, Rudy Kraft and Ray Turner, who's actually out at the water filtration plant. But you know, without volunteers that really care about the community and historic preservation, you know, things like this don't happen. And it's really, that's what makes our city special, is because of volunteers and people caring about our community and coming together. The other thing people like to thank for is that we are a City of Boulder City committee. So we're, you know, volunteers, but this is a city committee. But you know, this happens because of the support of the council, the staff. But I'd like to really give a big shout out to two people in the city in particular. Susan Daniel Levitz, who can't be here, as she told me, it's Mother's Day weekend, Alan. But you know, she did so much of the work that made this thing happen. And also Michael Mays. Is Michael around? Michael Mays here, who is constantly on his day off, and you know, they've really done a marvelous job making this thing happen. Okay. So what the schedule is today is that we're going to get a couple of history lessons. This is being sponsored by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. And then the young ladies over here are, you know, and this is kind of a reconnection. I mean, we thought this is the reconnection. And let me tell you how this started. Really, the story of this is all about Paul and Barbara Adams, who came to the committee and said, Alan, we should have this event up at the LA Water and Power Lodge. And I said, what is that? Like a lot of people, I had no idea it was there. And we cold called, Barbara and I cold called the LA Water and Power. We went up to their office up on Foothill and kind of knocked on the door. To make a long story short, they're here. And they sponsored this event. They paid for new curtains. They cleaned the building, the foyer. Just give a great shout out to the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. So anyway, what we're going to be doing is that Joseph is going to give a brief presentation and kind of give LA Department of Water and Power's version of their history with Boulder City. Then we're going to have Cheryl Nagle from the Boulder City Hoover Dam Museum to give Boulder City's version of the history. And not that we're trying to have a competition, but I found that being in the Historic Preservation Committee is like, if you ask somebody one thing and you ask another historian another thing, they'll have different points of view, and that's what kind of makes it interesting. And you know, I've spent a lot of time talking to Dennis McBride and Mark Hall Patton, kind of my go-to local historians, and you know, they will disagree at times, and it's kind of a fun thing when that happens. And you know, history, and it's part of it. You know, a lot of you are part of the history of this town. And again, then we're going to have a panel discussion moderated by Heidi Swank, our state legislator, and the director of the Nevada Preservation Foundation. Okay. Anyway, so before, without much more ado, thank you all for coming. And here is Joe Romallo.
Thank you very much, Alan. And thank you all for coming today. It's really exciting to see such a great turnout and so much interest in seeing the lodge and being here today. This, like Alan said, this was just a completely fortuitous opportunity. And for me, it began about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, when I first came out to Boulder City with our general manager, David Wright. And before him, Marcy Edwards, whose father and grandfather had worked for LADWP, had told me about the lodge. We'd had a media inquiry from a reporter at the Daily News, and if you know anything about LA media, the LA Daily News is much more conservative, they serve the Valley, and it was very critical of DWP's ownership of the Executive Lodge. Said, why are you owning this property? You could sell it, it's probably worth, and he gave some estimate based on some real estate sleuthing that he did. Came out and looked at the lodge, and we had this kind of critical article that frankly by the end of it all, our GM said, well, the reason we don't sell it is because you don't sell history. But with that, Dave wanted to come out and see the lodge and understand better really what it was and what it meant, and how we could better partner with the community to better utilize it, or at least make it more accessible for people to appreciate its historical place in really what is a shared history for Los Angeles and Boulder City. So with that, just by complete coincidence, it was definitely meant to be that Alan had reached out through one of our persons who was visiting, and we connected, and here we are really today. So I want to thank Alan. I also want to recognize and thank Leslie Woodbury, First Lady of the City, who helped with all of the work and getting through the museum, the help in getting this building cleaned up, and some new furnishings, as well as a couple new furnishings at the lodge that you'll see if you haven't been yet today. Just curtains and other things. I also want to tell you in terms of the lodge, we have an architect now at DWP who's really taken on the lodge as a project. So while it's really been maintained very well, we want to return parts of it over time to more of its historical basis, the way it used to be. So with that, I wanted to walk through briefly some slides that we had. Also, just before I go on, I want to make sure I recognize Don Cotterill from my staff is here, as well as Deborah Hung from Los Angeles, and also Vincent Avila, our caretaker, who, if you're on the tour, we'll have met or we'll meet later today. Vincent's been great to work with. For me, I want to make sure you know I am not a historian. The extent of my history work is doing my own personal Ancestry.com work, and together with my wife, who's way better at it than I am. So what I'm going to share with you is really what we've managed to learn in just a short period of time getting up to speed. One of the challenges we have at LADWP right now is we have a lot of executives in our power system who are moving quickly through and retiring, and we're losing that history. We'd like to come back and do this periodically with you, and there are some experts who are working at other utilities now because they've retired, who I'd love to have come and speak to you about their experience here in Boulder City and with the lodge. But for us, it's really important to try to maintain that connection with you all over time. So with that, let me just mention, I'm going to do my best to be accurate, but as I've learned just in the last few days and just today, there are little bits and gaps of history that are filling in as we go. And there's some mysteries and unanswered questions about the lodge and who was there and when and such. So as you know, 6 companies built the Executive Lodge at the suggestion of Henry Kaiser, and it really was meant to provide accommodations for folks who were visiting and dignitaries. He believed that government officials, business leaders, and other VIPs would want to visit the dam, and extending hospitality at an Executive Lodge would facilitate visits and potentially secure new contracts and business opportunities. And if you'll see when you visit the register that we have from the original registry of visitors, that was when the property was owned by 6 companies, it's a who's who of infrastructure in the West, both electric as well as just the largest companies, Kaiser, Bechtel, others, their representatives and relatives as well. I think you know it was designed by an architect, George de Colmesmill, who I probably didn't do justice to his name, and the construction was completed in December 1931. We have these presentations available for you if you'd like, and I want to make sure you had a takeaway to really keep with you. The old historic train station, as I understand it, is behind the lodge in this photo. And this was also a contributing element to the City of Boulder City's application for historic designation on the National Register of Historic Places. There was actually some misunderstanding about this at DWP. Folks thought it was in fact on the registry. One of the things we love to work on, together with hopefully help with the museum, is getting that designation nationally for the lodge, all in part in keeping of its historic nature and keeping it preserved and available for access and for tours and such. The interior was furnished with Monterey furniture. It was built in made in Los Angeles. The luxurious furnishings reportedly cost $30,000, and that's from a Joseph Stevens Hoover Dam: An American Adventure book from 1988. They had a lot of formal guests. They extended the dining room into the living area there, and most notably there was a luncheon held for Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark and Crown Prince Ingrid in 1939 when they came to tour Hoover Dam. And we have found when the property was transferred to LADWP, let's see, there was the lodge, the Crow House, and 11 other properties were transferred to LADWP. And this is the approving document from the Board of Water and Power Commissioners. It was approved by the board in 1935, and the transfer was completed in January of 1936, if I have it correctly. Total cost for all properties was $30,000, and we've owned the lodge since. Over the years, specifically in the early 2000s, we transferred some properties and auctioned off some of the homes that were owned by DWP at that time. I don't have a lot more history on that. One of the challenges has been with our own archivist that works at our records center is getting a lot of information about our activities here. So in all honesty, you probably know more about these homes either through your own personal family histories or through your own historical resources that were here today. This was just an example of Ezra Scattergood, our chief engineer and really the father of power in the city of Los Angeles and our power system. This was invitations that were sent, and we have the original documents. These are just images of them. These were invitations sent to various individuals to stay at the lodge and enjoy hospitality there for meetings regarding Boulder Dam. This is one of the agendas from the meeting that was held in, I can't read the date on that, November 15th and 16th, 1960. And that was concerning meetings involving the Boulder Canyon Project Adjustment Act, operation of the Boulder Dam, funding and appropriation, study of water supply in the upper basement, and all related activities. So there were a lot of just business meetings that were held at the lodge over the years with lunch served, and there was also the opportunity for individuals as they needed to stay there. I wanted to point out that there's a great resource online through our Water and Power Associates. If you type in Los Angeles Water and Power Associates and Google it, you'll find that they have a great amount of history there on DWP's power system. One of the challenges we've had at DWP is we are far more knowledgeable about the history of our water system, in part because it has been in such dispute over the years with Inyo and Mono counties, and it's been litigated. And so there's a lot more factual information and primary information available for us. The power system has been underappreciated, and what's really nice is to come today with a group like you all who we have a shared history and we have mutual appreciation and respect for each other. We're not appreciated as much, and there's definitely a more difficult history on the water side. So on the power side, it's just nice to meet with people who welcome us and say, hey, DWP, you're an important part of our history, and we appreciate you. So we appreciate you as well, and I want to thank you for that. Just briefly, one other thing. I mentioned the architect. His name is Scott Fajak. I would like to put him in touch with some of you who have met today, as well as our panelists, because he's doing research on the lodge. We're going to, over time, slowly restore aspects of it so that it's a little bit more in keeping with the way that it was years ago. The other one is, I mentioned historic designation, and then also the unanswered question of did President Herbert Hoover ever stay or visit the lodge? That's been a question. We haven't found evidence of it specifically. But today, there's a photo of it at the lodge. If you see it when you go in, it's just in the right, in the main living room, that Vincent said he found when he moved in over 20 years ago, and it was buried. And it says Herbert Hoover visited, and it has the 2 dates on it. And one of the dates, he was in Boulder City. So that was the day, or the days after his defeat. So it says, let me see if I can find my note here, sorry. It was November 12, 1932, where he went from, essentially in the days preceding that, from Palo Alto through Glendale, Pomona, and made his way to Boulder City and did a national radio address here in Boulder City on that date. There's a record there that says he was at the lodge that day. And then May 2nd, 1933, which would have been after his presidency, I believe, if my history's correct, that he was there. So we'd like to really figure that out and nail it down. because it is a little bit of a historical legend, and we'd love to be able to get it more concrete. So thank you so much for having me, Alan. Thank you all for your hospitality today, and
Just a quick note, if you are scheduled for the tour now's the time to leave. If you're, there's also at the 1 o'clock tour, this program may be a little bit late, so be conscious of, what time is the tour? 1 o'clock, so it should be 12:50, you should be out there. And Blair has the tickets, okay? Because there are limited tickets, and if you miss it, I can't guarantee you're going to be back on there. Anyway, next we have Cheryl Nagel from the Boulder Dam, Boulder City Hoover Dam Museum. I got it right?
Pretty close. All right, thank you, Al. Can you hear me in the back okay without this?
No.
No, okay. It's a pleasure to be here today. I met Joe when he was up here on one of his trips, and he's really piqued my interest in finding out more about the lodge and also this building. So I'm pretty excited about that journey when we're going to figure a few of these things out. There's always been a question about, did a president stay in Boulder City? Did they stay at the hotel? Did they stay at the lodge? And so that's a fun question to look for. I was asked to briefly, and I'll try to do that, introduce this building. But let me go back a little bit first as to why Los Angeles Water and Power is in Boulder City at all. It goes back to when the bill is introduced into Congress, and of course, bills get modified and ran through committees and things. And the end bill has some provisions in it. And one of those provisions has to do with how the money is going to go to the Department of the Interior. And it was kind of a novel thing, well, at least by today's standards, is that the money would not be an out-and-out appropriation. It would be a loan. And there were conditions on that loan. And one of those conditions was that the Department of the Interior had to prove that they could pay the loan back. And that's where LA Water and Power comes in. There are a lot of entities that were willing to take all the power that the dam produced. And there's a lot of good stories associated with that. But what it comes down to is the Secretary of the Interior has to make a decision on who gets how much power. And LA Water and Power ends up with the largest appropriation, almost 40%. And in that contract that they sign is for 50 years. So it's 1935, with the completion of the dam to 1985. And one of the things about LA Water and Power is not only did they get the contract, but they had the bonding power that they could use as a resource to help build the dam in Boulder City. And LA Water and Power, of course, can't start producing electricity until the dam is finished. So their role really begins in 36, 37, after the dam is complete. And they are required to install the generators and maintain them and to deliver the electricity. So it wasn't just that they had the contract for the power and somebody flipped the switch and sent it to them. They actually had to have people on site, working on the generators, even after they were installed, and maintain them and switching them and all those sort of things. So they had a significant workforce here. After 6 companies is done and they leave Boulder City, LA Water and Power acquires the lease to a large amount of their holdings. about 430,000 square feet of building. So they not only bought some of the buildings that were up here that such companies had used, but they bought houses, they bought Babcock, Wilcox, or they leased them, because you couldn't buy them there. And anyway, that's how they become involved in such a central role in Boulder City. And they chose to build this building as an administration and maintenance building. And it gets built about 1940, and it's described as Spanish colonial revival with weepy mortar. And I think it's very clever the way that they place the building, because when you drive by and look at the building, which is perhaps the third most iconic building, you know, after the administration building and the Boulder Dam Hotel in the historic district. From the street, you have no idea how big the building actually is, unless you walk around it or drive around it. It's a substantial sized building. And it is set off by this octagonal lobby, this kind of formal entryway into the building, and which picks up the Art Deco elements that were incorporated by Gordon Kaufman into the dam. So you know they're aware of those elements, and they use them throughout the building. And if you look around and see, you'll see those different elements in this building. And LA Water and Power becomes more than a good neighbor. They actually set a standard for neighborhoods. They maintain their neighborhoods. Because remember, during this time period, you could only lease homes. So their employees that were leasing from them those homes were maintained by LA Water and Power. And there were restrictions on what you could do on the exterior of that building, what kind of fence you could have, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So these houses that they own up around here really became like the showpiece for Boulder City as this model community. And they maintain those, and that sentiment carried on after they sell the houses to private holders. You know, most of the people, maybe all of the people that own residences in this area that were either LA Water and Power or California Edison, I hope that's not a dirty word, are real careful about how they maintain their homes and how they keep, you know, them up, similar to the way they were when they were first built and occupied by those employees. Also, what LA Water and Power did is they opened this building to the public. I remember coming up here as a kid to Boy Scout courts of honor, you know, both Cub Scouts and Scouts, Eagle, you know, receiving Eagle badges. And there were also other social events that they opened it up to. Because, you know, you remember they had a large workforce here, and that workforce was part of the community. And the LA Water and Power, the people running this up here, the executives, were very sensitive to that. And so they wanted to be part of the community. And I think they were very successful at it. And this is a magnificent building. It's, you know, you don't miss it when you drive by by the street. And I think that as time goes by, you know, it will only continue to enrich the community. And we're very fortunate that the city owns the building and recognizes its importance. So I might have gone over my 10 minutes, I apologize. So, I think probably hold any questions till after the panel talks, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Oops, sorry. Thank you, Cheryl. No, he's just to let you know, if you're a Boulder City resident, one of the perks of the town, you get into the museum for free. Go see Cheryl. He knows everything. Anyway, here, hi.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks everyone for being here. It's a great group, it's a really large group. Always good to see people who are excited about old buildings like I am. So my name is Heidi Swank, and I am the Executive Director of the Nevada Preservation Foundation. We are a statewide historic preservation nonprofit. We are new. We turned 4 years old last fall. We do work statewide. We have projects all over the state, in southern Nevada as well as in rural Nevada, doing various projects in lots of different communities. It's been an exciting adventure.
Hello, I'm Alan Stromberg. I'm a local architect. I've been doing architecture here since the early 80s, and I've had a great opportunity to work on this building and many other buildings in both historic buildings and putting new buildings in the historic area that try to emulate the architecture of the period. And it's been a lot of fun, and it's been a very enjoyable thing. Definitely for me to work with all the people. I was on the historic preservation committee with Alan. I was on the historic preservation with Alan and the group for a number of 10 years, and it's really been a great learning experience, and I've enjoyed every minute of it.
My name is Tom Tyler. I'm the president of Emergency Aid. The city of Boulder lets us use the building for our organization. We run the food bank. We also have different, we help with rents. We help with emergency with the police department if they have problems at night. We handle domestic disputes and stuff, getting people rooms and that. We try to direct people to the right organizations. We do a lot of getting people to the right places. We are kind of a Band-Aid. We also just help people basically from Boulder City, unless they're stuck here, transients and stuff like that. But we have programs for them too, to get them help. We try to get people closer to their health network, and letting this building has done everything for us, because we have a back dock that we can get our food bank from. We distribute state food. So the city has just been so wonderful letting us use this building and stuff. So, thank you.
Howdy, I'm Mark Hall Patton. I'm the administrator of the Clark County Museum System. We have one of your DWP buildings. We've got a Babcock and Wilcox house out at the County Museum. It is restored. You can come out and see it. But I run the Clark County Museum, the Howard W. Cannon Aviation Museum, which is the one in McCarran and 2 other airports, as well as the Searchlight History Museum, and an outreach exhibit in the Moapa Valley. So I'm trying to cover most of the county. And of course, if you watch television, I do that as well. So, and I've been here just under 25 years, so I'm a newcomer to the area. But, you know, I've run museums for 40 years now. It's a great job to have, I can tell you.
I'm Dennis McBride. I'm director of Nevada State Museum, Las Vegas. I was born and raised in Boulder City, and I've written a few books about the place, and I've been here 63 years.
I'm Randy Heese. I'm the director of the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Boulder City. I came here 2.5 years ago to take that position. I absolutely love the place. So I've been here less than anybody else. Previously, I ran a historic house, museum, and historic farm for the city of Fremont, California for 13 years.
Hi, I'm Roger Shelf. I'm the General Manager of the Boulder City Museum and Historical Association, the owners and operators of the Boulder Dam Hotel and the Boulder City Hoover Dam Museum. I came in 2005 when I took that position. I just want to thank you all for coming out today. Being here for 15 years, I've been able to observe you guys fighting to preserve your history and always willing to support our efforts. So I want to thank you once again for being out here today, and hopefully we'll be able to get some things together and get some more things done. Thanks.
My name is Leslie Woodbury. We're getting feedback maybe if I stand.
Turn away from the speaker. If you turn the microphone away from the speaker.
All right, I'll just put my back to you.
That's what you should do.
So anyway, I've been here 30 years. When I married my husband, I moved here. I'm the Museum Development Officer. As all of you know, historic preservation takes money. And that's been my job for the past 8 years, raising money for the Boulder City Hoover Dam Museum and helping with some educational outreach.
Thank you. And if Leslie, I'm not sure if you want to come sit over here to be away from the speaker, we might solve that little feedback problem. So I did send out to most, I got to get to most people just a couple of questions to kind of start off the discussion. I would really like to encourage the panelists to also ask each other questions. I think it's a much more fun, much more interesting when we all kind of talk to each other than me asking all the questions. But just to start off, I've kind of gotten on this thing lately, kind of this brief experience I've had so far of advocating for older buildings. There's been a lot of misunderstanding, I think, among folks about what constitutes historic preservation. There's an inherent idea, there's this idea inherent in many circles that there is an inflexibility in what they see historic preservation kind of allows and what it really shuns and what it scorns. Like what constitutes historic preservation? So I really thought that would be a good place for us to start to talk about historic preservation here. Too often we're focused on either a building site or structure or a landmark's origination story. We talk about what it was originally. And we see only that really initial content for that structure. But that initial content might have been linked to an economy, to a community, to a person that no longer exists. And done well, we know that these buildings will outlast hopefully all of us, right? And there will be a lot of changes that happen around these buildings. And we need these buildings to remain a vibrant part of communities as they change. So I've been really talking with a lot of folks about this need to kind of shift our focus into something that's much more of what I'm thinking of as a panorama that encompasses not only a structure's origination story, but what I like to call chapters of a house or a site or a landscape. And I don't know how many of you have been able to went to the lodge already this morning. If you've already been there, and if you haven't gone, you're going this afternoon, there were some chapters that I saw just this morning with that lodge that are really important. And I think there's a great picture around here somewhere of the exterior over there by the doorway. So look at that on your way out if you've already been there, and look if you haven't gone yet. Because there's definitely chapters in that building. So when you go through it, you'll see that the original bathrooms were all Jack and Jill bathrooms. If you know what those are, a bathroom that's accessible to 2 bedrooms. So they were all Jack and Jill bathrooms. But now they have this mirror that's put in them, because the mirror, and it's on 2 sides of what used to be a doorway into one of the bedrooms. And so none of the Jack and Jill bathrooms exist. And that's because they were adapting with the ways in which people thought about how you live in homes and how much space that is in a house should be shared. Right? So that idea that they enclosed parts of those Jack and Jill bathrooms shows this chapter, this really rich chapter of that house. There's also a conversion of what I believe from looking at those photos of the exterior. As part of the bedroom that has the picture of Hoover in it, part of that bedroom, I believe, was converted into a bathroom. And living in a 1956 house and having restored a pink bathroom, I was so excited to see that it had pink tile, and a pink toilet, and a pink sink. So that's a great chapter of that building too, right? That there you see that mid-20th century history that is part of that building. And now that is historic in itself. And there's also the enclosure of 2 porches as part of that building's history. The porch that you initially walk into became a sunroom, and then the other 2 that you can see, that porch you can see very prominently in that photo, that was enclosed and made into 2 additional bathrooms. So these chapters that happen with buildings, this is how they're living structures. And I think we need to start to think more broadly about that when we're looking at old buildings. So I think that a focus on the structure as having chapters really gives us much more flexibility to reuse a structure or a site in ways that are useful for today and what we hope will be in the future. So I kind of posed this idea to the panelists, of this idea of chapters, that a structure has chapters. And so I was hoping to get some ideas, because we have people from a wide array of backgrounds here, of within your field, what does it mean to recognize chapters of a building, a site, or a structure? And how do we make sure that a building doesn't have so many chapters that we lose its origination story? Because we certainly don't want to give the chapters more prominence than the origination. It needs to be a balance. So I'm not sure, Would you like to start?
Okay, can you, actually, I would not like to start.
That's fair.
Can I have Roger speak on that in our behalf, because he represents that part of our entity.
Okay.
If you
Okay,
have
so
questions
Roger.
about raising money.
Okay, because that always comes up for sure.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say I very much appreciate what you recognize as an essential element of preserving historic buildings. You can think of some buildings that maybe have a singular historic focus, like say the Alamo or something, and they're gonna vehemently preserve the Alamo to represent that historic event, and what it means to Texas and the United States and, well, Mexico for that matter. And then you have buildings that sort of evolve within the community. You'll find them in smaller towns like this or all throughout the country. And they have a specific interest to the community, but they also have a national story to tell. And a lot of times, it's the culmination of those historic buildings that tell that national story or that larger story. As the manager of the Boulder Dam Hotel, I inherited what you're talking about. I had a building that has a very important chapter 1. It was built when the dam was being built. And it had experienced many formations or many businesses over the years. And it's had a different personality with almost each one. It's very interesting to look at the photo history of the Boulder Dam Hotel, and you can see that. And you can also see the hotel adapting to the times that it's existing in. So it would pick up elements of it that were popular in the time. So we had that problem to face. We had to confront preserving that portion of the hotel that aligns with our mission, which is the Boulder Canyon Project area. But we also wanted to preserve what it meant to the people of Boulder City throughout all of its various chapters. One of the things that we did, so we looked for maybe elements that sort of united them all. And one of the things that we found was that once its original owners left and new owners began to take over, it became more and more a sort of social and cultural center for the town. You had the bar that everybody went to down in the lounge. People got married there, several different restaurants, and it became a social center. So when I started to talk to the board a little bit about our job wasn't only preserving the artifact, preserving it as an artifact, but also preserving it as a concept. So I would talk about preserving the historic essence of the building, not just those things. So we painstakingly studied, and with the help of almost everybody here, a lot of the historians here, those elements of the building that are crucial to understanding Chapter 1 and that still remain. Our windows, the paneling in the lobby, the mortar and masonry, the spatial arrangements in the building, those kinds of things. And then how can we use it today as people of Boulder City need it today, and also a way consistent with the way people in Boulder City have experienced it in the past. And we strive to do that. And one of the things we do is we donate it every time we have a chance to social and cultural events in town. The American Association of University Women hold their wine and chocolate events there. Political meet and greets happen there all the time. So we wanted to we budget for that. So we wanted to keep that essence that each chapter spoke to alive over there in the building. And we aim to preserve that as well as that Chapter 1. I hope that.
With the county museum, we've got 20 restored structures there. Not everyone is restored to the origination point of the structure. And we've had to look at each one from what it was when we got it, what kinds of changes we would have to make to take it back or to restore it to whatever time period, and what did we need to use it in terms of interpretation. So we have, for example, the Giles Barkis House, which was a building built in Goldfield in 1924, after the big fire up there. And then it was moved down into Las Vegas, into Clark County. It was over on Giles Street near Hacienda. And it was turned into an antique store. But when it came out to the museum, it was initially restored as a home, but we changed our minds as we went along and saw how people were interacting with it, and have restored it now to look as it did when it was the odd shop, the end of its history in public use. Now that doesn't mean that we don't talk about the origin of the building. We have that in there as well. We have why it got moved down here, all of that sort of thing. That's all part of the interpretation that we do. We have the Gaumont House, the Prosper J. Gaumont home. This building was built in 1931. It's actually restored to 1959, during the time that Prosper Gaumont had it. And by the way, you'll love the bathroom, it's all green tile.
Not as good as paint, but.
Yes, I got that. But it was one of those that enough changes had been made to that house during the 50s and into the 60s that to take it back to 1931 wasn't as important for us. We would have had to do too much damage to the structure. So we made the decision to take it to 1959. And in each of our structures, we have one room that is set aside as an interpretive gallery. Unlike a lot of historic homes, we don't embalm ours as, you see it once, everything's going to exactly be the same every time you see it, and you have no idea why it's important until some guide tells you. We have an interpretive gallery in each one of the homes to talk about what was happening in the valley and what was happening in the county at that point in time. In the Gaumont House, we talk about civil defense, we talk about the rise of television, we talk about the test site, we talk about a number of things that were happening in the 1950s and 60s. But we also have a Formica top table in the kitchen. We've got cigarette butts in the ashtrays. They're fake cigarette butts, but we have them there, depending on what it is that we're doing in there. We have another building, and it's the one that we're going to be restoring next, which is the Grand Canyon Airways ticketing office from Boulder City. This is the one that was then moved up into town and was the home of Henry and O.C. Bradley, first black couple to be here. And that one we've got because Dennis couldn't take it. And he called us and said, this needs to be saved. So that one we're going to take back, and it's only a 2-room building, it's a shack. But the forward room will talk about Grand Canyon Airlines. The back room will talk about the black experience here. So it will be much more of an interpretive gallery rather than a full-on historic restoration. No matter what you're doing, you have to make those kinds of decisions, and you have to keep track of what decision-making you're doing, why you're doing that, and make sure that you let the public know when they're going through what they're seeing. You know, at times you may not want to take off something that was added in the 1980s, but you might want to say, this is what it looked like in the 1930s. This is what it looks like today. This is why the change was made. A lot of times, you know, Jack and Jill bathrooms were fine in the 30s. You know, people think it's very odd if they have to use the same bathroom these days. I mean, in the 30s, you had motor courts. Your bathroom wasn't even in your hotel room or your motor court room. It was in a central building, as was the shower. You know, you didn't get that in your room. No. In the 30s, that made sense. Whether DWP would take it back to those or not, who knows? But even if they don't, you can still interpret it. You can still have that as part of what you're telling with the structure. So anyways, that's what I was going to say.
In railroad preservation, we immediately, before touching an object, do a preservation or restoration study. And generally we do that using the Secretary of Interior standards, which are not so much standards as guidelines. And we fall into a number of traps. One of which is you're not supposed to look at the buildings as options for restoration. In a Secretary of Interior's reports, we ignore that. Another one is, of course, the first thing they ask is the address of the object, and our objects move, so we have another issue. But so we always take an object, and railroad cars in particular, they could have very long service lives. We have cars in the collection that have been in railroad service for over 100 years, in active service, not just in preservation. And so you have to look at the changes that technology brings. Air brake changes, coupler changes, safety changes, air conditioning. You know, much of our collection was not air conditioned when it was built in the teens and 20s, and we seem to think that's a requirement in this environment. And we continue to be a regulated railroad, so the FRA has going to put in, so we do look at that, and it's amazing what you find. We have, in other institutions, have had cases where if we were to restore a railroad car to its 1882 origin story, we would lose 90% of the artifact. That's how evolved the artifact had come. And so in that case, we chose a 1904 date, which happened to be when it was in service in Nevada, in southern Nevada. And we were able to preserve about 90% of the artifact received. And so we look at those things, and it also told a different story. It told a story of Nevada, not a story of the Central Valley of California. In our Carson City Museum, we have a car that's incredibly frustrating. It was built in 1868. It was at Promontory Point, Utah, on May 10th, 1869, as Stanford's private car. It went on to be owned by the Virginia Truckee Railroad and be a passenger car, a coach. They took the partitions out, and we have this car. I've actually ridden in it for a short distance. It's a complete railroad car. But its moment of significance was May 10th, 1869 at the Golden Spike. And we can't get it back there. We don't know enough information. So for the present time, we're stabilizing the artifact and making sure that the artifact will survive for someone in the future to make a better or more informed decision then. So our job sometimes is to keep everything we got and hang on to it and preserve it and maybe put a tent or a building over it so it can be preserved later.
My turn. Gosh, my job. Before you approach a property and decide what you're going to do with it, or a railroad car, or any significant property, with chapters, first you have to recover those chapters and you have to write them down so that you can understand exactly what it is you're dealing with and what's significant and what's not. I think one of the main issue, I think, is the issue of adaptive reuse. You have to be very pragmatic when you're approaching a property. And I think one of the most shining examples of that in the southern part of the state, and certainly in Boulder City, is the Boulder Dam Hotel itself. I mean, by the 1990s, it had really long past its viability to be a hotel strictly alone. And so it became an art gallery, it became a museum, it became a bar, it became a restaurant, it became professional offices, shops, and it became a small part hotel. And it's been very successful, and it's been done with a great deal of sensitivity and taste and attention to all of its various chapters over the last, 70, 80 years nearly, I think. A couple of more great examples in Boulder City is what Grant Turner did with the Rodeback House, which is now the Forge over next to the police station. That little house is very important. It was one of only 3 stone houses in the city, and the owner was one of the first insurance agents in town, so it had a history. But again, its viability as a residence was really past. It was in an unfortunate spot. So it's been adapted, it's been reused now as a restaurant and a social center, and it's worked. It's been great. The old Bank of Nevada building, which is now Dillinger, that also, when the banks moved out of the center of town, and what are we going to do with that building? It was many things. It was part of the drugstore and various sorts. So Grant Turner again has turned it into the Dillinger, which is a very, very popular night spot and restaurant, not only in Boulder City, but people drive out from Las Vegas specifically to go to the Dillinger. So that was another very successful example of adaptive reuse. And I don't know how many of you have been around long enough to remember that Fremont Street used to be the commercial center of Las Vegas. Even when I was a child, that's where my mother took me, down to the J.C. Penney building, the Sears building, to buy my school clothes. Well, when the Boulevard Mall was built in 1966, and J.C. Penney and Sears and Ronzoni's and a lot of the important commercial establishments on Fremont Street moved out to the edge of town. And so those buildings became derelict, they became this, that, and the other thing, strip joints, whatever. But it's been in the last few years, perhaps the last 10 years, I think, since Tony Hsieh came to town. And Las Vegas has changed. I'm circling back to this. The area that they call the Arts District, which was sort of the industrial district of Las Vegas along Main Street and Charleston Boulevard in the 1930s, 40s, even into the 1950s, small manufacturers, warehouses, things like that. That stuff moved out of town. It's become far less important to the commercial viability of Las Vegas, and so they've been turned into the Arts Factory. They've been turned into some wonderful restaurants, Mingo and Artifice, down there along Main Street, antique shops, restaurants, and all down along Fremont Street. The J.C. Penney building was the Emergency Arts building, and when it could no longer be a department store, it became a burlesque museum, it became a coffee house, it became offices for the people who own the El Cortez right across the street, and the same thing with the old Sears building across the street. But in achieving this adaptive reuse of those buildings, they have maintained the architectural integrity of them, more or less, mostly, yes. And it's that sort of thing. You have to think, okay, how can we maintain whatever architectural significance, historic significance that this particular property has, and we have the history of it, but how can we also be very pragmatic, because as she said earlier, it takes money to make these things survive. So what can we do to do both, to compromise? How can we come up, make this into what we can to be a viable money-making proposition and still maintain its historic integrity and importance? So I think there's a lot of great examples of that, not only in Boulder City, but in Las Vegas as well. And I think that the attitudes in Boulder City are changing, beginning to change somewhat, and I'm very happily surprised. And there's 1 or 2 properties that are in question right now, like the old filter plant. Okay, what are we going to do with it? Are we going to turn it into a private residence, which was suggested? Is it going to be demolished? Can we come up with some kind of viable compromise where it can be something that makes money, that brings people to Boulder City, but its historical integrity and its architectural significance are saved? Those are questions that have to be answered as we go forward.
You know, sometimes you can find a building that you don't have to change, that it fits all your needs. Like for emergency aid, us being here, we have our office space, we have our warehouse facility where we can bring in the trucks and the food and stuff. So it's worked out immensely for that. Also, our clientele is all around this area. Our low-income housing is right along the street, as well as the bus line and things like that. So we haven't had to adapt the building, except we adapted to the building. So we can maintain the historical significance outside of the building and stuff, and still be very functional. I would like to point out that in Boulder City, Money Magazine made us one of the 25 cities to retire in. And the historical preservation, I think, has a lot to do with that. I'd also like to mention that our crime rate is 60-some% lower than the rest of the country. Now, I'm not saying that emergency aid, our police force, and I'm just saying that looking at the community as a whole, advancing the historical sense of it, and just supporting our community does so much for all of us. So, thank you.
Talking specifically about this building, years ago the city approached me and they wanted to put some community toilet rooms in the downtown area for people that are walking through, tourists and so forth. And this was the site they chose, and it really produced quite a challenge to put restrooms in here when the building is about 3 feet, almost 3 feet elevated off the street level. We chose that into the building because the sidewalk does slope up there, and I was able to put a ramp in that comes gently down from B, another ramp up this direction. We put a new door in there. I used the design of the overhead structure and the jambs from the front door here, so it looked just like the original, and introduced fixtures that they would have used during that period for light fixtures. And I think that if you didn't know that it had been added for next year, the goal was to make it look like it's always been there. Use the same type of twisted railings and so forth. So it's always a challenge, especially. And then when the restrooms, of course, are ADA, and that's another thing that we constantly face in reusing old buildings, is the challenges of access and then refitting the interior for the larger accessible restrooms and the larger, wider doorways. It's always a concern, and it's often hard to do in a compatible manner to the existing structures.
So thank you everyone for those great comments. And I think, so for some people, I think a lot of us here, in some ways we're preaching to the choir, get that idea that historic preservation has this, it's a balance between change and maintaining the historic integrity. But for some people might start to wonder, well, if there is that flexibility, what are we doing? What is historic preservation? And so I'll tell you that I jokingly call myself a building hugger. I think it's, I will often, extol the virtues of my favorite era of architecture, and, I think that I often worry that my love of mid-20th century architecture kind of distorts the view of what historic preservation often is, and so I've tried over the last couple of years to kind of dial that back a little bit. But there was a great piece that came out in Arch Daily a few years ago. It's a great blog. It was a piece with the title, "Do Architectural Preservationists Know What They're Fighting For?" And emerged out of a debate over preserving postmodern architecture, which is going to be, as preservationists, our next battle. And I think it is going to be a much bigger battle than mid-20th century architecture was the modernist movement. I mean, I think the TV show Mad Men was extremely helpful in explaining mid-century architecture to people. We kind of need a TV show taking place in the 80s to explain postmodern architecture, and I'll be honest, I need postmodern architecture explained to me some days too. But it was a really interesting piece because there are some very strong feelings out there about postmodern architecture and historic preservation. And so there's a couple of quotes that I just wanted to pose to the panel to get some of your thoughts on, because it really does got me to really think about what it means, what historic preservation is about. So the first quote is, whether a building is worthy to be saved does not depend on anybody's personal experiences of that building or whether it is liked. In fact, it doesn't even depend on whether a building is any good, right? The building does not have to be good. That stopped me as I was reading that, right? Then the next part, in the field of history, it is now generally accepted that understanding our past is key to making better decisions in the future. While other events, periods, and people might be best remembered through documents, images, and trinkets, the best record of an architectural period is unquestionably the buildings that represent it. So if then architectural preservation is an act of recording history, what matters is not whether a given building is good, but rather whether it is important. And to me, that really changed a lot of the way that I thought about historic preservation, because I'm not a huge fan of postmodern buildings, but when they become historic, I will fight for them, right? It doesn't matter if they're a good piece of architecture, doesn't matter if you like it. This is all of our past recorded through buildings. So I'd really just like to kind of throw that to the panel and see what folks have to say.
I always have microphone issues apparently, but I just had a thought. I'm sure Roger would echo me on this because most of my ideas come from him, but I was thinking this as we were talking about the previous question as well, that Boulder City needs to decide what its narrative is. I think most of us know what that narrative is, and then we need to select which buildings tell that narrative the best and decide that those are the ones worth going after and saving. And I'm not sure an agreement has ever been made on that. As a museum, we know some that we identify as very important to our narrative, this being one of them, and we chose to have this as one of the main stops on our walking tour because the entry does tell an Art Deco, a very deliberate architecture that happened with the 1930s to bring the mentality from a very depressed state, having gone through the Depression and the Dust Bowl and World War I. All of those people had faced those things, and they started to build buildings that showed power and strength to overcome those problems. The design of the dam was very deliberate. They took away the gargoyles that were originally supposed to be on top of it, and they replaced it with strength and stainless steel and terrazzo floors. And you see that in the entry of this building as well with the tile work and the LA Water and Power logo that's in the center of the room. This tells our narrative, and we had some problems that Alan Stromberg, we wanted to make this an exhibit. We wanted to sort of bring the museum out into the community in creating the walking tour, and this doesn't have wheelchair access into that room. And we had to put these gates in. We chose an Art Deco motif. The museum did the gates that you see in the entry so that people could come and see the exhibit but not access the rest of the building, so emergency aid would be protected. But those stairs are very historic. They have their own narrative. They're made out of a stone that we can't find anymore. We don't want to ruin those stairs, but making them wheelchair accessible, so we had to put a handicapped access to the exhibit outside and an additional one inside so that everybody could experience it as much as possible. But anyway, I think that's Boulder City's challenge, is to come up with identify the narrative, come up with the buildings that tell that narrative, and then work with a way to preserve those buildings.
really, really important point. But something that you have to keep in mind, I think, is that a town may have more than one narrative that are very important. And certainly the original narrative of Boulder City is the construction of Hoover Dam and the workers' cottages down along the avenues and so on. But there's another part of Boulder City that speaks to a very important historical narrative in the country, and that's the post-war boom. And all those little motels along the street, along the, was it Boulder City Parkway now, whatever they call it this week. Those are very, very significant buildings. I mean, they look pretty awful right now. But if you're familiar at all with what they've done in Palm Springs, for instance, with those mid-century modern motels, those drive-in motels, those have become a huge draw for that city, and people love that stuff, and they want to stay in one of these places. And Boulder City has 5 or 6 of them sitting right there just waiting to be preserved, adapted, and made to best represent that narrative of this town.
I'm going to get back to the comment about the building doesn't have to be good. You know, if you come to the museum, you see the Babcock and, well, not Babcock and Wilcox, it's fine. But if you see the Giles Barkas house, this is not much of a house. You know, if you see the Grand Canyon Airlines ticketing office, it's a shack. They're not great buildings. They're not architectural wonders by any means. They've got very important histories, and they're ones that help us tell the narrative that we're telling as an institution. Now, that's a different thing than looking at individual structures that you might own or you might look at and say that needs to be preserved. And you're right. I mean, we look at structures, look at a lot of industrial structures. Look at the structures around a mining camp. Those are not pretty buildings. They were not meant to be pretty. They were meant to be used. They're hammered up. They're torn down. They're modified. You know, buildings on ranches and that, they didn't stay the same. They were built to be used. But sometimes those are the ones that you have to hang on to somehow in order to have that part of your heritage still be out there. So there are times when we're going to be looking at buildings, and I've seen that in some of the arguments over some of the brutalist architecture.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I don't know that. Yes. But I mean, you're talking about an architecture that's not really easy to love, and it wasn't meant to be, you know. But I mean, we also live in the desert. It's not always easy to love, you know. But still, in order to have our heritage out there, doesn't mean you save everything. That's always one of the problems. When people want to save everything, you can't do that. You know, it's got to make some sense economically. When you get down to the bottom line, the only reason that the county museum has the structures they have is because the people of Clark County, you included, pay your taxes. That's what keeps that place open. We don't make it on $2 a head coming through the front door. But, what's that?
$1 for seniors.
$1 for seniors, yes, if you're over 55, like I am, or under 18, then it's $1. But really, you know, we've got that as a funding source. You know, all of us, I know that Roger deals with this all the time, and as do you with, you know, how do you fund an historic structure? I mean, it's not easy. And when you start looking at buildings, having good adaptive reuses, like you were talking about with Ford and that building wouldn't exist otherwise, because there's no way to make sure it's there. You have to make sure that as you're looking at what you want to preserve, you are thinking about how are you going to do it. It's easy, and relatively speaking, it's easy to get money to preserve something, to save it, to rebuild it. It's really hard to pay the electric bill. Nobody wants to give you money for that. The water bill, the sewer bill, yeah, there's one you want to go right, you know, having a big fundraiser for. Yeah, we're having wine and cheese to pay the sewer bill this week. Yeah, I don't think that's going to work for you. So you need to always, you know, yes, you're going to have structures that are not pretty and ones that still need to be preserved, but make sure that you always keep in mind that bottom line that, unfortunately, it's about the money. That's going to eventually come back and bite you if you don't plan for it up front.
I just want to say we have a sewer pipe out front if you want to drop a couple dollars in on your way out to help us pay our sewer bill. We appreciate it. You know, I'll try to do this briefly. Leslie and Cheryl have heard this too many times, but one of the things I was able to bring with me when I came here that I think has helped me contribute was my knowledge that I got from living in one of the small steel towns along the Steel Valley between Pittsburgh and Cleveland. And in the 1970s, when the steel mills crashed, there were 40 or so little towns along the rivers and railroads between those two cities, once great cities, one of which still is, but and confronted with serious economic problems. And if you go through there now, if there's 40, you'll find 34 of them that are pretty much in squalor and probably not safe to go through. I know they're not safe. And you'll find 6 or 7 treasures. 6 or 7 communities that faced the same exact thing, that looked exactly the same in 1970. Some of them are across the river or across the railroad tracks from the others. And what was the difference? What happened in those now healthy cities that didn't happen in the other cities? And they all began to look at, you know, their history or what's special about our town that we can attract people in here and things. But the ones that worked were the ones that were able to form an alliance of all the interested parties that behaved, that talked to each other with candor, that made the kind of decisions about, you know, would take Dennis's input about the hotels there, which, you know, I agree with like 100%, but that would become a part of the discussion. And someone that maybe didn't necessarily value those hotels like they valued the Avenue houses or something, could speak with candor, and those issues could be laid out on the table. And then, because listen, history that didn't only happen in the past. Central to your question, history happens every day. What we decide is important, that's how history is written. And if you go into classrooms, your history classrooms, your 11th grade history class today, it will be different than the 11th grade history you learned. The history didn't change, but the way it's perceived is different. And so history is always changing, and the people of the present have an obligation to contribute to the history of the past and to decide what's important about that, what we're going to remember, how we're going to process it. That's our obligation. It's such a big obligation that it can't fall on anyone. It can't fall on the city of Boulder City to do that. It can't fall on the Boulder City Hoover Dam Museum to do that, or the Historic Preservation Committee, or the Arts and History Council in this town. It requires an alliance, and it requires an alliance that's dictated by candor, where people can discuss honestly, that real issues can take surface, and that people are willing to make compromises. And then you come out of it and you say, okay, we know that we didn't hit everything, but this is what we decided together, candidly, what's important. And if you go look at those little towns, Chagrin Falls, Ohio, Beaver, Pennsylvania, that are thriving today, you will find that in their history. You will find that event in their
Be trying again this session, and so I would love anyone and everyone to come and testify in support of my bill. I will let you all know and keep you in the loop. Session doesn't start until January of next year, but this is something that our towns and our older buildings really need. So with that, I will open it up to questions. If folks just want to raise their hands, and I'll kind of call on people. I think it's going to be hard to pass the microphone around, so maybe just use your teacher voice. And if you have a question for a specific panelist, go ahead, feel free.
Specific panelist?
Either way, either specific panelist or to the entire panel. Your choice.
Well, to two speakers, and I have to pick specifically to, I don't know your name, is it Mr. Hall, Pat, or Mark, and Mrs. Woodbury. I've heard the saying, we can't save every building. And you haven't said what specifically you mean by that. It's almost become a mantra in Boulder City relating to the historic district. So I would need to know what specifically is being said, historic preservation in Boulder City is going to become incredibly important as soon as the bypass opens. Our history and what we're offering to tourists are a state of mind, historic buildings, and an ambiance. And if you could tell me which historic buildings aren't important, and you want to, you're not going to put money into those or going to be torn down or lost, I don't know if you're saying that and you haven't made that clear. The two examples that come to mind are the filtration plant and the hangar. The city council just tried to sell those, and with public outcry, they backed down. This building has deferred maintenance. The filtration plant, the roof has leaked horribly for years and years. The city hasn't put any money into it. The hangar was claimed to be a tear down in a recent appraisal, but we're getting $8,000 a month, and there was a very low appraisal and a quick attempt to sell it, and luckily, by public outcry, those things have been backed off of. So I would like to hear what specifically you're talking about in terms of when you say we can't save every building, do you have buildings in mind? Because together collectively, Boulder City doesn't have any buildings to spare. And if we don't get creative and do something with the filtration plant and the downtown, we aren't going to have the draw that we need. So I'd like to hear what specifically we can sacrifice.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start off there and say that I think it's probably not possible for any individual up here to give a list of buildings that should be saved and should not be saved. I'm not sure if the city of Boulder City has done this yet, but I know one of the things that we're currently doing in Gerlach, Nevada, is we are doing a reconnaissance level survey of historic buildings in order to provide an analysis of what buildings that are, we're kind of roughly going with the 50-year mark. We're actually going into the mid-70s just to provide a little more longevity for that study. But to provide the city with an analysis, a building by building analysis, to determine which ones are significant. Because as we know, it isn't necessarily the age of the building that makes it important, it's the story that's with it too. So I would say that it's probably gonna be very difficult to list out buildings that should be demolished at this point or could be demolished. I think there's a long analysis that has to happen, and I would really encourage the Boulder City hire an organization to do a reconnaissance level survey, a windshield survey, just to get a better idea, kind of get your arms around what you have so that some decisions can be made going forward.
Well, I think, nobody at this point is going to sit down and write a list. We're going to demolish this building, save this one, and this one, and this one, and so on. But Neil makes a very, very good point, and that's why this moment in Boulder City's history of historic preservation, or lack of it, is so very important. Because I feel I've seen the attitude changing, and I have to go back to what Leslie said. You have to have a narrative first, or two narratives, or whatever. You have to decide what you are, who you are, before you can approach historic preservation, because the point of historic preservation is to maintain an identity and a community, and if you don't know what you are and where you came from, you're not going to be able to do any viable historic preservation. And that's been the problem, I feel, in Boulder City as long as I've been alive, which is a very long time, is that they've approached this without a coherent narrative or sense of what they are and what they want to become. I think in part the bypass is forcing that question on the town, and so far I've seen that some nice glimmers that it's being approached in a serious way that might work out. So Neil's point is well taken, and so is Leslie's, but this has to be established first before we can decide what's going to happen and what's not.
So first, to the first part of it, we can't save everything simply because we don't have the resources. When you start looking at buildings and you figure that every building that we have there has to have a roof on it, and that roof has to be replaced every 25 or 30 years, and window frames here where it's masonry buildings, they have to be painted. All of these things have costs. So to the first to that, we can partially solve that through understanding that they don't have to be preserved as historic buildings, they get to be preserved as an old house that somebody lives in. So we have a resource issue. And it's bigger on things like the hangar and on the water treatment building, which don't have yet a viable use that can produce enough income to care for them. The second piece though, but to support some of your comments, one of the things that makes this town so spectacular is the continuity of all the buildings. The fact as you come up Nevada Way, you do see the rundown but intact mid-century hotels, and you see the cottages that surround us. And they speak to a time, and it's a consistent time. And if we knock down one of them and put up a 80s modern building in the midst of the 30s modern houses, it wouldn't work. So we have this community where things very much work together as a single story, and we haven't lost that yet. And that's one of those things that the community has to support internally. And by the way, in historic preservation, if we were to go and take one of these houses and nominate it for the National Register and it got put on the National Register, there'd be nothing to say the owner couldn't knock it down. There's nothing absolutely preserving these buildings except the community as a whole and its pressure to maintain them.
I also wanted to say again, Neil, that you've made another very good point. Boulder City's visual identity, which is the streetscapes, the buildings, is very small. And so you have to keep in mind that if you tear one or two things down, it's going to make a far more significant difference in the visual identity than if you tore it down in Henderson or Las Vegas.
They've done it in Henderson.
And and so.
No, I mean, and that's a good point. You look at downtown Henderson. Henderson had a downtown, and it was built at a very small period in time, in the early 1940s during the war. And if there was a national symbol of the origins of Henderson, it would be the cinder block, because that's what they built everything out of. But they have gotten rid of all of those, and so you have a real problem there. You have the townsite houses there that thankfully a number of those still exist, but it's a good counterpoint to what you're looking at here. But to say, which ones are you going to save, which ones are you not going to save? No, you can't do that unless you've done the survey. I mean, the worst thing in the world is to react at the last minute, I think, of your hospital recently, and try to do something when the decisions have been made and all of this has come about, whether or not it was done in the middle of the night in a smoke-filled room or whatever. But that doesn't work. You've got to plan ahead of time. So yes, you need the narrative, but you've got to have the data. You've got to have the surveys. You have to know what you have. What buildings are out there. There's some little buildings out there that are quite early. Alan and I talked to the owner of one of them down on Boulder Highway here. Carol, is it? Okay. That, she loves her little building there, and it's a very early structure as part of the Union Oil area there. And she loves that little building. Is it part of your history? Yeah, it is. It's a nice early one too. But you need to have that, and you don't want to find that out 2 days after the bulldozers have left the field. Because that also just happened last year? Yeah, last year in Henderson when they tore down Jim Thorpe's bar. It's gone. And it was gone overnight. So you need to know this and make sure that your city, you're working with your city, and you're making sure that they're not putting out the demolition permits that you need, that somebody wants right now, because once the permit is issued, it's real hard to take that thing back. And most people that are demolishing something, they want the bulldozers there now.
I'm not really part of the panel, but I figure we get one commercial, right?
Just to let you know what the city and the committee has been doing lately is like, one of the things you'll see up here is the proposed Bullet Field Historic District, which would be the first new historic district in Boulder City since 1983, the Jansch report. So that's been gone through the Planning Commission, but one of the things the committee has put as its priorities this year is to get a CLG designation, which is a certified
Certified local government.
Yeah, so certified local government. It's basically, we are looking at getting surveyed, once we qualify for this with SHPO, there's talk here about creating a new historic district along Nevada Highway, or whatever we're calling it this week, as Dennis said. But there are interests in there, and I think it's one of the things that we'd love to have, at the Historic Preservation Committee, is that your input and support, because we'd like to expand our historic district, but the first thing we have to do is to figure out what we have. And the inventory and what they're talking about is crucial for that first step, is the rigor. Let's find out what we have before we lose it. Thank you.
I just want to say that I love Heidi's idea so much that we've been suggesting it to the council for about 2 years now, to identify what structures are important. I think a study like this does need to be done. I think that will happen. I think the city is moving in that direction. And also, just to point out, there are many different ways to preserve our buildings in Boulder City. The government will not be able to do them all. And that the Boulder Dam Hotel is a perfect example of something with private ownership. It is a nonprofit organization that the government happens to help with somewhat through small grants, but they don't maintain it. If they did maintain it, it would cost them about $600,000 a year to do what we do. We do it for far less of a cost to them. And so I think we can look at partnerships. I think that there's lots of different ways to preserve history. And some will include the city being heavily involved, hopefully. So.
Thanks. So I just wanted to return, make one comment following what Mark said too, is that not only when you are advocating for a building do you need to start really early, but you need to know where your fight actually lies. I know that we were helping some folks up north who just lost several buildings, and they had been asking their city council to not allow the demolition, only to learn that that city process, demolition orders are staff approvals, and the city council would probably never intervene. So the issue was not to go to the city council, the Historic Preservation Commission. It was to find a change in ordinance so that demolitions are not necessarily staff approvals. And actually it's something that now, after that conversation with those folks, that we just ran into in Las Vegas. So if you know the Denny's that's on Las Vegas Boulevard near, it's on like this little pie wedge of Main Street of Las Vegas Boulevard, we are going to lose that. And sadly, they're going to tear down a mid-20th century building to rebuild a retro building that looks like it's kind of mid-century. So it is what it is, but we did learn through that process, because when we heard about that, we realized that Las Vegas has the same issue, that demolitions are staff approvals. That means if you meet the certain requirements, staff have to say yes. And so we now know that where our fight is, right? So we need to start talking to city council and figure out if there's any wiggle room, not for this building. This building is done, right? We need to look further ahead. We need to think what's gonna happen 5 years down the road. And I think that goes back to what Mark was saying, is that we can't, as historic preservationists, because we're really starting to get this head of steam, I feel like, in Nevada, we're going to lose some things in the front, but we can't get too fixated on what's right in front of us, because then we'll always be looking at what's right in front of us. We won't be looking at those fixes that take longer, and in the future will mean that we will be more successful. But it's still just starting to really, we're all kind of starting to get together and get ahead of steam, but it will mean that there will be losses. So with that, we have been up here for over an hour and a half, and so I would like to release the fabulous panel. If everybody could please give them a thank you. And thank you so much for coming. It was really enjoyable. Thank you.